Bill Skarsgård's story does not begin with confidence, certainty, or instant recognition. It begins with quiet observation, inherited expectations, and the heavy shadow of a famous name, because growing up in a family already known to the world meant that comparison was unavoidable long before he had the chance to understand who he was on his own terms. From an early age, Bill learned what it meant to be watched, judged, and measured, not by strangers at first, but by an invisible standard that whispered questions into every room he entered, questions about whether he was talented because of effort or legacy, whether success would ever feel earned, and whether his own identity would ever exist outside someone else's reputation. This pressure did not push him toward loud ambition or forced confidence. Instead, it made him quieter, more introspective, more aware of his own internal world, shaping a personality that learned to survive through depth rather than dominance. Unlike many who grow up close to fame, Bill did not rush toward the spotlight as a solution. He approached it cautiously, almost suspiciously, aware that attention without understanding could be more dangerous than invisibility. Acting, for him, was not about validation or applause, but about exploration, about stepping into emotional spaces that allowed him to process uncertainty, fear, and curiosity without having to explain them out loud. Early on, he realized that his strength did not lie in charm or traditional likability, but in presence, in the ability to hold silence, to make discomfort meaningful, to communicate emotion through stillness rather than exaggeration, and this realization quietly separated him from the expectations placed upon him. While others chased roles designed to be admired, Bill was drawn to characters that were broken, misunderstood, or unsettling, because they mirrored parts of himself that had never been allowed to speak freely. As he continued working, Bill Skarsgård developed a relationship with fear that most people spend their lives trying to avoid, choosing instead to study it, inhabit it, and understand its power, because fear, when controlled, becomes influence. He learned how subtle movements, pauses, and expressions could unsettle an audience more deeply than volume or aggression ever could, and this understanding became one of his defining traits. While many actors aim to be relatable, Bill aimed to be believable, even when that meant making people uncomfortable, because he understood that discomfort is often where truth lives. This willingness to lean into darkness without glorifying it gave his performances a gravity that felt earned rather than forced. The turning point in Bill Skarsgård's journey did not arrive as a sudden transformation. It arrived as recognition of what he had been building all along, a reputation for commitment, intensity, and emotional honesty that could not be faked. When opportunities finally emerged that allowed him to bring his full range to the screen, he did not treat them as chances to impress, but as responsibilities to deliver something unforgettable, and this shift in perspective changed how audiences saw him. He was no longer just another name from a famous family. He was a presence, someone who could dominate a scene without demanding attention, someone who could make silence terrifying and stillness powerful. What made Bill's rise particularly striking was the way he carried success without softening his edge or reshaping himself to fit comfort zones. Fame did not make him louder, it made him more precise. Recognition did not push him toward safety, it encouraged him to explore complexity even further. He understood that the moment he tried to become universally appealing, he would lose the very thing that made his work resonate, and so he chose a path that prioritized substance over popularity, depth over surface. As Bill Skarsgård moved deeper into his career, the line between control and surrender became the space where his most powerful work lived, because he understood something many never do, that true intensity does not come from forcing emotion, but from allowing it to surface naturally, even when it feels uncomfortable or exposed. He began to approach roles as psychological landscapes rather than performances, studying not just what a character does, but why they exist, what they fear, what they suppress, and what they would never admit out loud, and this method gave his work an unsettling authenticity that lingered long after scenes ended. Instead of relying on dramatic excess, Bill refined the art of restraint, learning how the smallest shift in posture, the slightest pause, or a controlled stillness could communicate more menace, sorrow, or vulnerability than pages of dialogue, and this precision became one of his defining signatures. With greater visibility came a new kind of pressure, not the pressure to prove himself, but the pressure to repeat success, to deliver familiarity rather than growth, and Bill faced this crossroads with quiet resistance. He refused to be reduced to a single archetype, even when audiences and industries tried to freeze him inside the image of darkness he portrayed so convincingly, because he knew that being trapped by success is a subtler failure than rejection. Each project he chose was a calculated risk, a deliberate step away from comfort, designed to stretch his emotional range and challenge both himself and the audience, and this refusal to settle allowed his career to expand in unpredictable directions rather than narrowing into a single lane. What separates Bill Skarsgård from many of his contemporaries is not just the intensity of his performances, but the discipline behind them, the invisible work of preparation, research. Bill's evolution as an actor also reflected a growing confidence in subtlety, an understanding that not every role needs to dominate the screen to matter, and that sometimes presence is defined by the ability to support a story rather than overwhelm it. He began to choose projects that valued atmosphere, tension, and emotional complexity over scale, trusting that audiences would follow if the work remained honest. This trust in the audience, and in himself, allowed his performances to breathe, to unfold gradually, and to leave space for interpretation rather than forcing conclusions. Behind the growing reputation was a person still deeply aware of impermanence, of how quickly momentum can shift, and this awareness kept his ambition focused rather than frantic. Bill did not chase visibility for its own sake. He chased alignment, roles that resonated with his instincts and values, even when they defied expectations. This selective approach slowed his output but strengthened his impact, ensuring that each appearance felt intentional rather than obligatory, and reinforcing his image as an actor driven by curiosity rather than fear of irrelevance. As he continued to explore characters shaped by isolation, trauma, and inner conflict, Bill Skarsgård refined his ability to humanize darkness without excusing it, to reveal the emotional logic behind disturbing behavior without glorifying it, and this balance required empathy, control, and ethical awareness. He understood that the most unsettling characters are not monsters because they are unreal, but because they reflect distorted versions of human emotion, and this understanding infused his work with a psychological realism that resonated deeply. Audiences did not just watch his characters, they felt unsettled by recognizing fragments of truth within them. With each passing year, Bill's career began to resemble something rare, a body of work that prioritized depth over dominance, evolution over repetition. As Bill Skarsgård's career matured, something subtle but powerful began to define his presence, a sense that he was no longer just inhabiting roles, but shaping the emotional temperature of the stories he entered, influencing tone, rhythm, and tension simply by existing within a frame. This evolution did not come from dominance or authority, but from awareness, from an actor who understood how energy moves through a scene and how silence can redirect attention more effectively than dialogue. He became increasingly comfortable letting moments linger, trusting discomfort, trusting stillness, trusting the audience to lean in rather than be pushed, and this confidence transformed his performances into experiences rather than displays. What once felt unsettling now felt intentional, controlled, and deeply human. With this growing mastery came a clearer understanding of limits, because Bill recognized that the same qualities that made his work compelling could also become restrictive if left unchecked. He resisted the temptation to let darkness define him entirely, choosing instead to explore contrast, irony, and emotional variation without abandoning the depth that had become his signature. This balance allowed him to avoid being confined to a single emotional register, demonstrating that intensity does not require constant severity, and that vulnerability can exist alongside restraint. By expanding rather than abandoning his instincts, he protected his creative identity while keeping it flexible enough to evolve. The industry's response to Bill Skarsgård also began to shift, not in volume but in tone, as conversations moved from surprise to expectation, from curiosity to trust. Directors no longer wondered whether he could carry psychological weight, they assumed it, and this assumption changed the nature of the opportunities offered to him. He was no longer being tested, he was being invited, and with that invitation came responsibility. What remained consistent through this transition was his refusal to chase external validation, because he understood that applause, while gratifying, cannot replace alignment. He measured success not by visibility or scale, but by resonance, by whether a role expanded his understanding of human behavior or challenged his emotional vocabulary. This internal metric insulated him from the volatility of the industry, allowing him to remain focused even when trends shifted or expectations fluctuated. In a profession defined by comparison, Bill chose introspection, and that choice gave his career a stability that many louder trajectories lacked. As audiences continued to engage with his work, a deeper appreciation emerged, one rooted not in spectacle but in credibility. People trusted him to take them somewhere unfamiliar, to explore discomfort without manipulation, and to respect the intelligence of the viewer. This trust was not built overnight. It accumulated through consistency, through performances that refused shortcuts, and through an evident respect for storytelling as a craft rather than a vehicle for self-promotion. Bill's presence became a signal that the work would be thoughtful, layered, and emotionally honest, regardless of genre or scale. Behind this public evolution was a private discipline, an ongoing commitment to self-awareness, emotional regulation, and creative curiosity that prevented stagnation. Bill remained a student of behavior, observing how people carry fear, power, tenderness, and contradiction, and translating those observations into nuanced performances. He did not isolate himself from ordinary experience, he drew from it, understanding that the most unsettling truths are often the most familiar ones, slightly distorted. This connection to real emotion kept his work grounded, preventing intensity from drifting into abstraction.